Thanks for joining us once again. I'm Sammy K. Powers, and this is the PHP Roundtable. This is a live podcast of developers discussing topics that PHP nerds really care about. The ultimate goal of this podcast is to learn a little something from each other. And if you're listening live and want to be a part of the show, send a tweet to @PHP Roundtable with a question or a comment, and we'll try to get your question/comment addressed as we go through this thing. PHP has a request for comments, or RFC, process to add new features to make significant changes to PHP, or to add like the newest, coolest idea. Even though the much anticipated PHP 7.0 was just released about a few months ago, many developers are already hard at work on 7.1. Today we're chatting with a few RFC authors about that feature that they are proposing to add to PHP 7.1. So, without further ado, in no particular order, let's meet the panel. First off, we have this guy who used to be very involved in PHP, but comes back to write random RFCs. It's Mr. Senor Tortuga. It's Phil Sturgeon. Welcome, Phil.
Hello. That was,
we also have. Was that?
That was good. Senor Tortuga is the correct pronunciation.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We also have the slayer of PHP frameworks and badly written cryptography, Scott Arciszewski. Did I get it right? Uh-oh, we lost Scott. Well, he's here, but we can't hear him. Well, Scott, work on your mic. You're not muted, but I think your mic might be broken. So Scott will hopefully be chiming in later. Also, we have Andrea Faulds, who is actually present but not present. She's in the Hangouts, but she'll be chiming in later on in the show, so she'll be coming in about halfway through. We also have François Laupretre, and I might just call you Frank to make it a little easier, but he's a Linux systems engineer and working on PHP as a hobby. Welcome, Frank. Do we figure out the mute button? Oh, you gotta unmute yourself. There we go. Yeah, we're gonna get the mute stuff working pretty soon. And finally, what's that? No. Okay, you're muted. That's good. Cool. All right, finally we have Davey Shafik, the developer evangelist at Akamai Technologies, creator of FAR, and he's D Shafik on Twitter. Welcome, Davey.
Hello, everyone.
Are you using? We were trying to figure out if you're using your British accent or American accent on this one.
When you figure it out, tell me, because I've got no idea.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's usually both.
So I wanted to kind of kick this off with some RFCs that have been actually officially implemented into 7.1, and I think Andrea's got one or two that have been implemented, but she's not here yet. So I think the next person up that actually has, Davey, you have one or two of your RFCs are actually already implemented for 7.1, right?
So I have one that's been accepted. It has an implementation, but they're waiting on tests, which is then the next RFC because it has requirements. So that's So I have one on HTTP2 server push support for curl. So it's fairly minor. I'm not a big C person, so it was as much as I could manage. So that got accepted, but it does need tests. But unfortunately, that means we need an HTTP2 server upon which we can run tests. So the next RFC I'm working on is HTTP2 support in the CLI server, because then we can run tests on HTTP2.
So what is it on HTTP2 that you implemented then? Like, there's something about push, right?
Yeah, so HTTP2 supports the ability for the server to actually push resources down to the browser and say, hey, we want to give you this, so you want it. And it doesn't have to be a browser, of course. Curl is a user agent that can do HTTP2. So it's something that's part of libcurl, and it has been for some time, and is now exposed through the PHP extension.
So is this like a feature that will just be supported by default, kind of like in the background, and it's not like a special function that you interface with?
Yeah, so it's basically options that you set. So you set a callback that will be called when a push is initiated by the server, and then you decide in that whether you want it or not. And then it gets pushed. Traditionally, it would go into the browser cache, but it just becomes automatically available as a response that you can handle, as if you'd made the request yourself. I mentioned it's part of libcurl. It does require libcurl to be compiled with HTTP2, which is the default, I think, on Ubuntu. And a few other distros, but it's if you compile it yourself, it's not the default.
What you've been involved in PHP core for a really long time, right? Like this isn't like your first RFC or anything.
It is actually my first RFC.
Is it really?
Yeah, the only other change I've had, I had a very small function added back in 5.3, which was a streams-related function. But that was kind of before the RFC process came around. So that got in there, and then I was involved in the creation of FAR, but I only did it at userland. I'm not a C programmer, but I'm working on it. So this was my first official RFC.
No, I could have swore I saw your name on the spaceship operator RFC.
Yes, so I did. I did write an RFC for that. I wrote it against 5.6. Andrea came along and did it for 7. Sorry, without realizing that I had done it. So she was kind enough to add me also to the 7, even though I had nothing to do with the actual code or implementation. I did come up with a name for the operator though, based on Ruby, which is the spaceship. So I think that's kind of what earned me the spot.
Nice. Well, there was another already implemented RFC that I was looking at, but nobody here on the roundtable was responsible for it. It was Sean DuBois and Rizia. I don't think I'm saying that right, but it's the class constant visibility RFC, and it basically allows you to take a constant in a class. Usually, you just define it with the const keyword, and then like in all caps your constant. And it allows you to mark it as private, protected, or public, just like you could with other class properties. So your class constants aren't always public by default. They'll still be public by default, but you can actually mark them as private, which is kind of cool. Did you guys see that RFC?
Yeah, I saw that today, and I was impressed with it, and also confused because I thought you could do that already. It strikes me as kind of odd that isn't already a thing, but I'm super happy that it is a thing now.
Yeah, I agree. It should have just been part of like when they added them in the first place.
Well, it's cool to see the oversights get corrected eventually in PHP.
Yeah, I've noticed that like version 7 and especially 7.1 are all aiming for consistency. It's kind of an eventual consistency thing, which we'll get there one day. But a lot of things that were quirky or wacky or odd or just broken in kind of the 5 series, most of them have been taken care of by PHP 7, like the uniform syntax stuff and the abstract syntax tree and all sorts of other things have just really made 7 be much more consistent, and 7.1 is fixing the little bits that are left. So yeah, it's weird that your constants are always public, so maybe you can hide those now like everything else, like all properties and methods and stuff. So that's good.
Well, you're just mainly spending most of your time in the Ruby world now, right, Phil?
Yeah, which is fun.
So why are you in this RFC discussion then?
Because you invited me. I don't know.
Just kidding. Yeah, of course.
I was going to say, like, the reason I occasionally am involved with RFCs, I don't really write any C. What I've done with Joe Watkins for 2 different RFCs, one of which passed, one of which didn't, is he likes to write the code, and I apparently am reasonably good at arguing. So what ends up happening is that I become like the representative of the RFC, and I write a lot of the RFC, and because I've been involved in so many of these arguments and heard so many of the same things come up time and time again, I now have the superpower of preempting what the problems will be with an RFC and kind of explaining away those problems before they're even brought up. And it's usually the same stuff. It's always, you can already do this by implementing some wacky shit way of doing it instead of this nice way you're proposing. So you put in like why the other way is kind of shitty and why it's different. So I can kind of tell what arguments are going to be had, and then improve an RFC to make sure it doesn't get stuck in the mud on those very same arguments.
And specifically, you've got an RFC that you messaged me a couple months ago, or it was like, I don't know, it was a little while ago, and you're like, hey, are you still wanting to contribute more to PHP source? And I was like, yeah, and you were like, I got an idea. So what was your idea, and what was the inspiration behind it?
The idea was a retry keyword, and the inspiration was nick it from Ruby. I've been working with Ruby a fair bit, and whilst I don't think that every single feature that every single other language should be bunged into PHP, and whilst I don't think that we want to turn PHP into Ruby because we could just use Ruby if we were going to do that, I do think there are quite a few nice things in Ruby that would fit very much at home in the PHP language. So some of them for example, the retry keyword basically in a try catch block, you can use the retry keyword to just execute the try again, right? You can just say, oh, you tried doing this thing, but we caught an exception, so have another go at that. And that's pretty useful for things like when you make a web request to another service and that service just happens to be down right now. If you get a rate limited response, or you get some sort of 500 error because it's just down, then you can just do like sleep 5 seconds and try again. And some people think that's silly because, it's a web request. You shouldn't be waiting for 5 seconds. Well, not everything's a web request these days. A lot of people are building command line utilities, workers. They've got like Beanstalk running, so they have like asynchronous processes, all this other stuff that doesn't need to be super fast. You can just say like, hold on a second and try again, and that's pretty handy. Hey, Andrea.
Yeah. Hi.
Andrea just joined us.
Unexpected delays, unexpected. Hi.
Well, I've got some questions for you, Andrea, in just a second. We were talking about the retry keyword RFC that me and Phil were kind of working on, and
cool.
So Phil had this idea of doing the retry keyword, and I started working on implementation, and I got as far as adding it to the AST, like I got it through the parser and the AST layer, and just right now I'm just figuring out how to get it to sort of, I think, be context aware, whether it's in a catch block, and then deal with all the opcodes that send it back to the try block. And
Okay.
I've been I chatted with Lee, I don't know his last name, who we worked on the C Spring together for PHP 7, and he was helping me to kind of understand like opcodes and stuff like that. And he actually, I think it was him that, or maybe it was somebody on Twitter who referenced a game that is like you have to fix like this old computer that's like you have to send opcodes to it and fix it when it breaks. I can't remember what it's called though.
I can't remember. It sounds familiar, but I can't remember.
Yeah, but if I think of it, I'll have to add it to the show notes. But Phil, I'm curious, like what you excuse me, you seem to have like already kind of I wrote like a little bit of the RFC, and then you kind of fleshed it out like in a whole lot more, like kind of anticipating, like you said, you're really good at anticipating what people are going to be saying and stuff. What do you feel like is going to be the biggest hump for the retry keyword?
The biggest hump for the retry keyword, along with most RFCs, like I said, is that you can already do it in this shit way, so why do you want to have this nice, tidy way of doing it, right? A very common response is you can just use more methods, right? You can just wrap things in more methods, but adding more and more and more and more and more methods to your class just so that you can easily re-execute something doesn't necessarily seem like the best approach. You shouldn't have to change the design of your code just for a control statement. The other very popular reason against using retry is that people can just use goto, and you can use a goto right before your try keyword.
That's fair.
Yeah, there's getting a laugh there. Absolutely. So the two things against using goto for this are, firstly, people have a really they have a hatred for goto, and sometimes it's justified and sometimes it's not. Goto in PHP is nowhere near as bad as it is in other languages. You can't just like go to different files and just like go to boom, and you have no idea where the path is going. It is much more restricted, but people just don't like them. People really hate goto, so when you try and have a useful conversation about why use a retry keyword when you can use goto, everyone just goes, I don't want to. But the other problem is it's not the same thing. You can put like goto label right at the top above your try, and then you can say go to there, which is kind of the same thing, but it's not quite as eloquent. Like internally, it could use the same logic, perhaps. Like all tries could like define one by at the start, whatever, right? It's just a different thing. And whenever people in PHP try and propose a new feature, so like they just say you can use arrays for that, you can use this for that, you can use something else for that. You don't need named parameters. You can have a class which is like a param bag, and you can do all this extra shit and hit the autoloader and document a separate class, or just use arrays. Like no, named parameters are the correct thing to use. So using the correct thing sounds like a better approach than just hacking shit with gotos, you know?
I mean, yeah, but it's like, it's not, oh, crap. Can I be heard and seen still?
You can be heard, but they're not showing up for me.
Yeah, it's the same on my screen, and I think I've probably broken my camera or something, because maybe Hangouts doesn't like me. But I can be heard at least. Like, I mean, I'd agree with you usually, but like, it's not something that's especially inelegant with GoTo. And the thing is, you're essentially adding another way to do GoTo, and like in JavaScript, you have this feature where you can put a label at the top of a loop, and then do break, and then that label, and it jumps back to the top of the loop or exits that loop. In PHP, you can only do it by number, but in JavaScript, you have that feature, and people mostly just use it to simulate GoTo. And I feel like this is the sort of feature you'd add if you didn't have GoTo, but since you have it, like, it reduces, it replaces one label and then this GoTo retry with just a single retry, which doesn't feel like that big of a gain. If that makes any sense.
The gain is just elegance, and that's kind of the approach in Ruby, is that Ruby tries its hardest to be as nice as it possibly can, whereas PHP usually settles for good enough. And it depends on the way that you got your code structured and how it looks. And if really the retry keyword is just adding a GoTo that you didn't have to write, then that's fine. You know, people can modify the file and change things. You have this one bit of GoTo floating off towards the top, further away, and it's just more kind of compact and self-isolated. If you just literally have a retry keyword and it doesn't require some other thing, which people might not know how they fit together, and it could, you know, move away, and like copying and pasting the block of code, the try catch that you're doing, and putting it in a different file. Like all these random things, they seem silly, but it's just having a retry is just really simple. Like, do that again. Go.
It seems to me that it's more about expressing your intentions a little bit more explicitly.
Yep.
At the call site, the nice thing about GoTo, I'm not 100% sure that the abilities of GoTo and PHP allow it, but I think it would be quite common that, say, for example, you would set up a HTTP client, like you mentioned, and then you would make the call. You would typically encapsulate all of that in a single try block, but it's only the call that failed. So with a GoTo, you could actually not have it go to the top of the try block, but to just before the call and just do the call again. So it actually is more featureful than a retry.
That sounds a bit weird. I would generally. I'd probably wrap that in multiple. Like, you don't want one method to be doing like 10 different things, right? No. So if you have a client, then you wouldn't really necessarily design it that way. Also, you see quite often people will have multiple catches on a single try. So based on different things happening, you can then do a retry or you can not, right? And that's quite a handy one. So like, you're not defining a label to go back to if you don't need to. You're saying that, you know, we're only going to retry it if this certain case is met, which means things are a little bit more clear, and you're not reading down like, where the fuck does that go to there? I don't know, maybe I'll work it out later on. Like, it just literally says, hey, this thing happened, try it again. And it's just the most semantic, clear, intentional way, instead of just like, well, I guess we can do it this way because it kind of works. You know, you can do it with for loops, you can do it with whiles, you can do it with anything you want. You can have a while true, and then you can say, like, keep on trying it unless foo equals false, right? There's loads of ways of doing it, but none of them are as expressive as, please try this thing again because it didn't work. Right.
I'm curious how you would actually implement this for failed HTTP requests, because I had just implemented a feature in a project that would retry chunked file upload, so you could try one chunk at a time, and if one chunk failed, you could retry that chunk again. And it was interesting that I had just implemented this feature in this project, and Phil sends me this message like, the retry keyword. I was like, whoa, I could have used that in that project I just did. So Phil, I think there was somebody had commented in the code on the retry logic that I was adding that they should add like a sleep 5 or something like that before it tries the next one. And typically, I'm very much not about adding sleeps to my code, as it kind of like keeps that whole process blocked up. And excuse me. And if I'm not using something like React PHP or something that makes it more asynchronous, it's really hard to figure out like how is it that. Do I just retry that request straight out of the gate, or how do you approach like retrying failed HTTP requests with maybe a little bit of a time buffer?
Right. Well, the idea of the sleep request, although it doesn't make your code as quick as it can possibly be, if you're trying to upload to a server and the server's not there, then you have to wait. Right? Like if the message you're getting from the server is "I'm not here right now," then you're going to have to wait until it's there, and there's nothing you can do about that. So that's when a sleep comes in. Otherwise, yeah, unnecessarily throwing in sleeps is usually a bad idea. But as long as you're not doing this stuff in like user-facing endpoints, so the user isn't literally waiting for 5 seconds to get there, then it's usually okay. And even if they are, like, if you're processing a credit card request and you need to have a response from the gateway to come back immediately, right? You need to have that before you can send them on anywhere else. If you do have to put it in user facing, then the user waiting for a couple of seconds is better than the user just getting an error saying "screw you, your card transaction didn't work," right? So depending on the type of response you get back, depending on the error code, you can react differently. And if it's a 400 and something, then obviously you did it wrong and you should give an error straight away. And if it's a 500 and something, then maybe waiting a little while and trying again would be a good idea because the server's overloaded or whatever the hell's going on, right? Just that.
True that. Well, I actually want to move this on to the to one of Andrea's implementations that's actually officially been implemented. Again. What's that?
This means I have to speak again.
It does mean you have to speak again. No, but I wanted to ask you about the void return types RFC that's been implemented for 7.1. So this RFC makes it so that a function can return void? Question mark?
It's sort of inspired by a bunch of other languages, like in C and C# and Java and a lot of languages with static typing, and also in PHP doc blocks. You can use void to sort of mean no return type. Like, it's not really a type because there is no void value. It's just this marker to say this thing doesn't return anything. And because that was one of the things that I felt was missing with PHP 7's return types, because you had the basic scalar types and you had classes, and there were some other things missing, but there's nothing to say this function doesn't return anything, which is quite useful. Because quite often you write a method or a function that just does some action but doesn't give you any result back, and having a way to say this function's return value isn't useful it is useful in that situation. It's mostly for documentation. And the other thing is interfaces. If you don't want if you want to make sure that a class implementing your interface doesn't return something in the implementation, then it's useful there as well.
Does it if you try to do a return statement of any kind, or maybe with a value, will it just do a type error?
It's only with a value.
Okay.
Technically, like, return with nothing and return null are equivalent usually in PHP, but I decided to make them not equivalent here. It's kind of a code style choice, so I decided that, like, if you provide a value, then it's not allowed in a void function, and if you omit a value or if you have no return statement, then it's fine.
So is it more to convey more, I guess, semantic meaning while you're looking at a code base and you say, oh, this function or method returns null, so that could either mean something in the code, or it could just be that it just doesn't return anything. Whereas if you say that this function has a void return type, it most certainly doesn't have any value that I would need to deal with.
Yeah, that was the thing. There was there was some disagreement. I think that the main thing people disagreed with in the RFC was naming, because we could name the return type void, or we could have a null return type, and the difference is that null is an actual type that PHP has, and so that would just return that would require your function to return a null value. And I was more in favor of void because familiarity mostly. That's what other languages tend to do, and it's also what we tend to use in the manual and in doc blocks. But there would be some point to having null, because in a lot of languages like C, C#, Java, some others as well, if you have a function with void, it has no return value at all. If you try to assign from the result of that function, it's an error. And in PHP isn't like that, and this RFC doesn't change it. In PHP, a function that doesn't return something, actually you just get null out. And that hasn't changed the void return types. It's mostly just this documentation thing. So there was some disagreement there, but most of the vote, but it still passed by a large margin. So
that's cool. So if I have a function, for example, in PHP 7.0 or lower, and I try to say my variable equals and then the function name or method name, and that method actually either doesn't have any return keyword in it, or it has a return keyword but doesn't actually return a value, so it's like return semicolon. Right now, if I were to var dump that variable I created with that function, it would say null, right? But you're saying if I were to use either have no return keyword or have a return keyword and just end it with a semicolon and not actually return a value, and then I try to set that to a variable, it'll throw a type error exception.
If you were using another language, yes. In PHP, I decided that it wasn't worth changing, so it's still a void function. Though it does say void, you do actually still get null out of it. The big reason for that is mostly because though it seems not very useful, in that case you really don't want to get a value out of it. Ideally, you'd have an error. It would kind of be a backwards compatibility problem, because there's a lot of code out there which assumes if you call any given function, you will get some value out of it. It's not an error. Some things, like some functions, if you pass them a callback, it will return back to you what the callback returns. And obviously, if you were to pass it a void function, then suddenly it would break if I made it so you couldn't use the return value. So void functions in PHP still return null, but your IDE will probably warn you if you try to assign from it, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah, it's often used, like Hack has it as well, and it's used in the static analysis part of it, where if you were, for example, to extend a class that had a method that returned void and then you tried to do a return, that would be an error. And of course, you think you're returning something when you're actually not or shouldn't be. It's more used for that rather than when you're actually calling it.
Yeah. Like a specific example I heard of was like people had implemented, like there are lots of these standard interfaces and frameworks and such, and I think there was some example of some framework provided an interface, and a lot of the implementations of it, instead of just returning null or some dummy value, would actually provide some extra information that wasn't in the standard, and then people would end up relying on this extra information that you got in that implementation, even though it wasn't part of the official interface. It was just something the implementations did. And that's something you can prevent in 7.1 by using a void return type, because if you implement an interface where it says void, you aren't allowed to return anything.
I like that. That's awesome. Well, by the way, it's nice to see you back. I know you had put so much stuff, added so many features, and been so involved in 7.0. And I know you got really busy with other things, and you had to focus on other things. And it's good to see you that you've been able to create some time to work on 7.1 stuff, and already have an implementation going. Do you have any other RFCs that you're working on or planning on? Maybe putting out there?
There's two that I have at the moment. One that recently got accepted, and one that is probably going to go to a vote at some point soon. So the one that recently got accepted was the list keys RFC. So are you familiar with list? It's this, like on the left-hand side of an assignment, if you want to if you have an array with several elements, numbered elements like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 or something, you can assign them like en masse, like in a group, into variables. So you can just say list ABC equals some array, and it'll set A to the first element, B to the second element, C to the third element, so on. But you can't do that with particular keys. So if your array has string keys, like maybe it's some JSON object or whatever, you can't use it there. It only works if there's numbered keys in order. So the list keys RFC is basically, now you can put which keys you want to assign from. So That's pretty much all it does. And it's useful in some situations where you have some. It's most useful where you have some associative array with some values and you want to unpack them into variables. The RFC didn't sell its case very well, mostly because it focused too much on potential future scope. Like, I have an idea from this syntax, you could make a further RFC that let you use it in function parameters, but we don't currently have that, and the RFC kind of focused too much on it, and I think that made it more controversial than it should have been.
You should have had Phil write it.
I'm not sure if that would have helped or would have hindered it.
So are you saying that
no,
something
Andrea
changed?
doesn't need the help sheet.
Go ahead, Phil.
I'll say Andrea really doesn't need the help. Awesome RFC generator over there.
Yeah, for sure. So are you saying that the list syntax has changed when you want to do a like you want to use an associative array?
Yeah. Like, actually, if I want to be really fancy, I could try and show this on camera, but I probably shouldn't. 'Cause it probably won't work very well.
And the people listening in their car will really enjoy it as well. I'm sure they'll.
Yeah. So like, so at the moment, like, the normal current syntax is like you do list, open bracket, and then a variable name, a comma, another variable name, and so on, and then just assign it, and then an equals, and then just an array name. So if I have an array with 3 elements, I can do list, open bracket, $A, comma, $B, comma, $C, close bracket, equals, and then the array name. So the new syntax is it's the same, opens with list, but you can also put, like, before the variable name, a key, so probably a string, and then just the arrow thing that you have in arrays, like an equals greater than
gotcha.
sign, that thing. So basically, it does what you'd expect it to, pretty much. I think it's most useful in sort of some. I find that I see list used a lot when people want to return multiple values, because obviously a function in PHP can only return this single value. We don't have multiple return values like you have in Go. So a common pattern is people will return an array with multiple elements for each of their sort of return values. Like Nikita Popov's fast route, which some frameworks use for routing. When you tell it to route, it gives you back this array which has like the handler function and the parts of the URL and and whether the like URL was found or not. And then the typical way to deal with that is you just use list to assign it into variables. But obviously the problem with that is, you know, that it's just an array with numbers. You only know what those indexes are by looking at the documentation. So now you could name those values in the array, and I think it'd help code to be more readable in that case.
Yeah, so I mean, I like the idea of the new list syntax for associative arrays. It almost like sounds like a precursor to named parameters. I don't know. Has anybody seen any RFCs about doing any named parameter stuff, or thinking about doing named parameters? Like,
named parameters are something that a lot of people want. The big problem with named parameters is basically a technical challenge. Like, the basics of it, I mean, I haven't tried to implement it myself, but I understand that actually having parameter names, you know, it's quite a bit of work to go into the engine, but that's simple enough. The big problem is that if you have named parameters, if you can, you know, specify, say, what each argument is by name, then suddenly the names you've chosen for your parameters are actually meaningful. And that turns out to be like a huge problem because every built-in function in PHP, each parameter is named in 3 different places. There is the PHP manual says one thing, and sometimes the translations of the manual are done badly and say different things in other languages because you've had someone translate it who doesn't realize that the name is a technical thing that can't be translated. So that's actually happened sometimes, where like the German version will translate number into number or something. But yeah, you have your version of the manual. You have in the source code itself, there's like above every function we have a comment, and that comment describes what the function does. And I think the documentation is actually generated from that initially, but then after that it's manually maintained, so that's not necessarily synced up with the manual. It might say something else. And then there's the actual thing that matters, which is these structures in the code that actually say what the names of the parameters are. So the problem is, if we turn on named parameters, someone's going to go and say, hey, I'm just going to use this built-in PHP function for, say, walking through arrays, and they're going to think that the first parameter is called array, so they'll put in array equals name and think, yay, name parameters, and then PHP is going to throw an error back at them because actually internally it's not called array, it's called R or something like that.
Right.
And
Yeah,
that's basically the
there's a
big
lot of
problem.
problems that could come up with that. For sure. Like and it's interesting that like I feel like that's going to keep coming up. You know, there's lots of things like that keep coming up in as proposed RFCs. Like let's get all the function names kind of all named the same, and let's get our haystacks and needles in the straight place. But I feel like some of those things are kind of like doomed to be never fixed. But that's one of the endearing things about PHP is that it's got these little tweaks, right? These little things about it.
The thing with name parameters is currently it really doesn't matter that much at all that the names are out of sync. Like it means that if you use the reflection classes and look at the names of the parameters using reflection, then yeah, they're not the right ones, but it's not really that big of a deal because again, you're only passing at parameters by name, and if you ever need to look at reflection, you mostly need the number. Yeah, it's not ideal that it's not the name, but it doesn't really have that much impact. And it is something that could be fixed. It's just a lot of effort. Nobody wants to go through all the functions and manually update them. Or you could write a script to do it, but like it'd be a lot of work to actually write something that looks at the manual and compares the comments in the source code and navigates the base to find where the name is declared as well. And it's just a lot of effort. And the other problem is not just internals, because like fix internals, that's great. Now, like tons and tons of PHP code out there that uses inheritance is now invalid because, you know, someone's written a class or an interface that says a parameter needs to be named this, and their implementation has changed the name of the parameter. And, you know, of course, in the past that didn't matter, but if we have named parameters, you know, suddenly we need to start throwing an error when that happens.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting, especially for like open source packages. Like you have to realize what's a breaking change. I used to not think that protected methods were a breaking change to change those, but if you think if someone's extended your class, then that's a breaking change. So there's all these little subtle breaking chains for changes that you would never think of if you're maintaining like an open source package. But I do want to actually move it on to François, Frank, and Scott before we run out of time because Frank, you've got some lots of really cool RFCs out there, or you've been working on a lot of stuff. And one of them, like, what would you say? Because there's so many. You have a list here of like to load PHP extensions by name and including the PCS pickle extension into the core distribution and a new cache key stream operation thing. Like, what are you what's the most exciting thing you're working on right now?
Some are related. The cache key, for instance, is related to PCS. But the most exciting, I think, even if it's not end user or end users, is PCS, because it's a way to. It's something that has been waiting for a long time. It's something that there has been proposals for this too, and it's a way to include PHP code in extensions, to write parts of extensions in PHP. Because as PHP 7 is still faster now, we have more and more reasons to more and more pieces of code that can be written in PHP related to performance. And we have, even if you look at just the extensions, including the core, there are many parts that could be rewritten in PHP. The main example I take is the PDO layer. The generic PDO layer, in my opinion, could be maybe fully rewritten in PHP, and it would make it much more maintainable. So PCS is a service for extensions. It's a generic service, so in 7.1 it will be proposed for inclusion in the core. And I think it's the most exciting part of the things you told about. Actually, there are two problems for including PHP in PHP code in extensions. The first one is to make code compatible with the code cache.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again? It was kind of breaking up for me. The first one was what?
You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. It was breaking up quite a bit there for a second. You said the first one?
Yeah. The first one is to make sure that the code is taken into account by the opcode cache. It must be cached. And today, code behind a stream wrapper could not be cached, except some special cases for file and far, but it was hard-coded in the opcode cache. So we need a way to communicate with the opcode cache to know if something is cacheable or not from the stream wrappers. This is the cache key, RFC, which is related to this, which is needed by PCS but not part of PCS.
So the cache key operation. So this is like a
cache key operation is the way for an opcode cache to ask a stream wrapper whether a given URL can be cached or not, and the key to use to cache it.
So if I'm if I'm making an HTTP request and it returns a not modified response, is that what you're saying? It would cache like the actual response?
It's not the same. It's not the same.
You're talking about opcode caching.
Opcode cache, because it's just for code. It's pre-compiled code. It's a way PHP can cache compiled code and then execute it again without compiling it again. It's quite special because stream wrappers generally are not used to distribute code, but there are some like FAR, PHK, and now PCS that are specialized in distributing scripts. So for these ones, the scripts must be able to be cached for performance reasons, especially on extensions, because that's code that is intended to be used again and again, and by many requests. So it must be cached. And the other, actually, that's the main reason. And this could not be done. I must look at something else. Excuse me.
While you're looking that up,
the second reason is very simple. Is when you expose symbols, you write PHP code. For example, let's say you have a procedural extension exposing only functions, and you want to build an object-oriented layer above it. We have many extension classes like this, and it's quite long and hard to build objects, classes, and write this layer. If you write it in PHP, it's very simple, very easy, but the problem is that the user code must know the classes. So the only way today is to load every script at the beginning of every request. And that's very long. Even if we use the opcode cache, even with the opcode cache, we can have to load tens or hundreds of scripts. So the second mechanism provided by PCS is to include an autoloader for this code. So the code registered by extensions will be scanned automatically at the when PHP starts. It will be built, and the code will be auto-loaded without any overhead at the beginning of the request. So that's the two main mechanisms we need to provide something really usable for many cases.
So it sounds like you're focused on not only optimization, but maintainability in your RFCs and what your contributions are about, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, and you also have you've mentioned here that you're taking over the FAR project. Is that right, Davey? Is he stealing it from you?
No, I did not write the C side of that. I could not write the C side of that. So I'm really excited that someone is going to give it some love. It definitely needs some. It's pretty awesome, that it's there. But I'm really happy to see someone taking it over. So no stealing involved.
That's something I do when I have time, because it's big work. First, taking over FAR, because FAR is very complex. It's not very complex, but it's a huge piece of code, so you must understand everything that's inside. Then I would like to build a new version, a new merger version, by merging FAR and an alternate system I had built that's named PHK, which is almost the same, but not the same. different, but many things can be merged. And I would like to, for version 3, I would like to focus on, especially among others, about signatures and mechanisms we provide to sign packages.
To make it more secure.
Because I think we don't have a mature offer for signing packages, source, and everything related to this way to authenticate and certify packaging.
Can I make a request? I ran into an issue. Can I make a request? I ran into the issue where I want to have a FAR that runs on the command line and runs through the browser, like can be included into something else. It's a library, but I want it to also be runnable on the command line. If you add a shebang to a FAR and you include it, the shebang will just be output to standard out. Obviously, if you run it on the command line, it's hidden. I would love to make it so that when you include something with a shebang, it is hidden, at least a FAR. So I'll put in a feature request, but that would be great.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand everything, but we can talk about it here.
Well, you mentioned getting the packages signed. Maybe we could get Scott in on that one.
Can you hear me at all?
Crypto guy. Yeah, I can. I can
Sweet.
see you on one screen and hear you on another. You're like in the chat room twice.
Yeah, I had to jerry-rig it. I'm having hardware issues.
Well, because you're working on an RFC to make actually, I think there was a RFC to deprecate mcrypt a long time ago, and then you actually created another one to remove it completely, or is that still in the works?
Yeah, I actually need to open the boat on that one soon. So the grand scheme of things for everything I'm trying to do for 7.1 and beyond is to make cryptography in PHP boring. And that word has a very specific definition to cryptographers. Boring crypto just works. It's easy for users to implement. It does everything correctly. It does everything obviously in constant time, so you don't have these side channel attacks. It's at least 128 bits of security, and it's usable. Like, you don't have to think about it too much. You just plug it and go. And that's the overall goal of the 3 RFCs I have. The first one is to get rid of mcrypt because, as Chris Cornut said in php.security on a free note earlier, he was trying to take code that was encrypted with the think it's pronounced Rindale. Someone corrected me on that like 3 or 4 months ago, and I forgot how it's pronounced. The Rindale 256 algorithm.
Rindale. So I won't try and pronounce it because I'm not Dutch.
So, AES was based off the 128-bit version of, let's just call it the R cipher to be lazy. And mcrypt gives you 3 different versions. One of them is 128, which is the AES cipher. Then you have the 192-bit and 256-bit. This is the block size. AES always has 128-bit block sizes, but the key size can change. Somebody well-known, Chris Cornutt, he runs the Securing PHP newsletter. He was trying to decrypt data that was encrypted with the R256 cipher, but he was trying to do it through OpenSSL, which doesn't offer that one because it's not standard. So there's a lot of issues with the mcrypt library. It hasn't been maintained in, I think we're at 9 years now since the last update. There's a integer overflow on 64-bit operating systems with the CAS256 cipher, and the fix that was proposed actually affected a macro. So looking at the code, you can't help but wonder if that affects other ciphers, since that macro is used pretty extensively. So mcrypt is basically just very bad news. So one of the things I want to do is get rid of mcrypt because it creates a lot of foot bullets for developers. It gives you counter mode, but it doesn't give you a CTR constant, so you have to actually pass a string in place of a constant there. The documentation used to be really bad, but it's since gotten better. It used to tell people to use ECB mode by default. Having a mcrypt AES alias for the R128 cipher would have been great, but at this point I think it's better to just get rid of the library completely since it's not being maintained upstream and replace it with something better. And we have OpenSSL for FIPS compliance and all this other stuff, but I was trying to also push in a second RFC to add a security library called Sodium. LibSodium, LibSodium, however you want to pronounce it.
LibSodium. We've had this discussion. I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Yeah. LibSodium. I don't know how Frank Dennis pronounces it. It's a modern, conservative, secure by default, and very opinionated library that falls under the definition of boring crypto. It gives you one true way to do things that's chosen for security and performance, and there isn't a lot of tweaking you can do. Like if you try to use crypto secret box, you get the X salsa 20 cipher, and then you get a poly 1305 authentication tag. And you can't really change that. It's not like with mcrypt where you can select your cipher, select your mode, you have to add your padding manually, and then you have to remember to add a MAC after that and prepend the initialization vector or nonce depending on which version or which block mode you're using. It's simple. You just pass it your data and you get your ciphertext.
So it's basically making it to where, like you said, making it easy. So if you don't have like a padded, well, see, no, I'm not a crypto guy, so this is it's like even I know that it's easy to mess up. Like you can do really good security, but if you mess up the padding on something, then suddenly everything is broken or it's easily cracked or something.
Yeah,
it's
there was
a crypto version of password hash, right? I mean,
can I throw in something on this?
Sure.
Yeah. Because one thing I think in PHP is that over the years there's been a lot of different ways to handle encrypting things and making passwords and all that stuff, and people don't really know that much about cryptography. So with mcrypt and a few of these other systems, people don't know what to do, and they just either pick the defaults or they pick the biggest number and assume that that's the securest. And because they've got this gross function with a bunch of things in it, they wrap that up and it's deep down in an encrypt function somewhere, and no one keeps up with what's good or bad these days. And it's just there, and they just don't think about it. So I think removing mcrypt, especially if it's not being maintained, and trying to move people towards secure by default systems, so they don't have to try and guess and do it themselves. Like even Laravel got caught out with using the mcrypt extension, but using random instead of urandom or something like that. Like people don't know what these things are, and if the massive open source projects are getting it wrong, then you can absolutely expect average Joe developer that started learning it last week to get it wrong, right?
Absolutely. That's one of the big problems that we've run into is that a lot of, especially the advice on Stack Overflow up until last year was really bad. I think the top voted answers on 7 out of 10 questions, if you type in site:/stackoverflow.com space PHP space encryption on Google, we told people to use ECB mode, to use the R256 cipher, for some reason they told you to generate an IV with ECB mode, but then they used encrypt rand, so even if they had the sense to switch to CBC mode, that would have been bad. There was like nothing really good about any of those search results.
How do you fix that? Do you just remove stuff and then like throw errors if people try and use it? What's the approach to get people off of bad shit?
So the overall strategy would be to deprecate the library, and in 7.1, in the next version after that, which I'm just going to call 7.2 for simplicity, we would actually move it out to PECL and not bundle it with PHP anymore. So if people need it, they can reinstall it from PECL. And one of the things I was actually talking to Chris Cornett about on php.security is I was actually going to write a library. It'd be like a user land implementation of these non-standard ciphers, but it would only support decryption. So you can easily import this library, decrypt all your data, and then re-encrypt it with a more secure method.
That sounds awesome.
So the third RFC I was going to be proposing kind of builds off the previous one. It's a pluggable cryptography library, or a pluggable PHP backend. Basically, it's like PDO for crypto. You would initialize it and say, okay, I want to use OpenSSL, or I want to use the LibSodium, which would be the default if I'm designing it. But it would basically be, instantiate, I want to do symmetric crypto, and here's my key, and here's my message, now give me ciphertext. And you wouldn't have to worry about what a nonce is, you wouldn't have to worry about padding, you wouldn't have to worry about key splitting, or any of these other things. It would be very similar to Taylor Hornby's library. That's Diffuse Security's PHP encryption library. I link to it pretty much every time somebody asks me, how do I encrypt data in PHP 5.4?
Right.
So
awesome.
if you're not familiar with it, I can tweet a link afterwards, and you guys can check it out. The idea was to take something like that, not necessarily his implementation, and make it just part of the language, like a PDO feature. It'd be like a high-level API where you just say, I want symmetric or asymmetric crypto, and I'm going to encrypt, or I'm going to sign, or I'm going to seal for asymmetric. Asymmetric, you have encrypt and sign, and then verify and decrypt. And it'd be very simple, straightforward, just for encrypting data. And then you could have multiple backends. Like let's say OpenSSL and LibreSSL and Boring SSL and all these other ones get killed by something like a quantum computer, and LibSodium is no longer used, and a third crypto library comes out like 10 years down the road that does quantum cryptography. You could use the same front-facing API the developers know. You could just say, oh, I want to use, let's just call it PQ crypto as the backend. And then if you can decrypt your old data, you can re-encrypt it with post-quantum crypto, and you'd be able to support a new platform.
It's sort of like the concept behind the password hashing, right? Is that like even as computers get faster and faster to be able to break these hashes, you can switch out the algorithm that's used behind password hash. As technology gets upgraded, and to the end user, nothing's really changed, right?
Yeah, and that was the other one. I completely forgot to mention that one. It's a small change. As soon as we hear back from the Argon 2 team, I was going to submit a pull request and try and get Argon 2 into PHP 7.1 is the new is an option for password hashing. It wasn't going to be the default one probably till at least 7.3, I think would be the earliest, or 8.0, whichever it comes out to be.
We have like a procedure for password hashing algorithm, because when Anthony proposed password hash, he was actually thinking carefully about the future, so he set down these rules about when and how we would introduce new algorithms, and when they would be allowed to be set to default, because he wanted to be, conservative about it and safe and make sure things worked.
Right.
Which is, a really good thing, because we don't really want to introduce an algorithm, like in 7.2, and then suddenly discover, oh no, this algorithm is terrible. This was a terrible decision. So we have to be very careful about it.
Right.
But
That's why.
We don't want to get to where, like, if bcrypt does get destroyed, we want to be able to get away from it quickly as well. So I know Anthony put a lot of thought into that.
Yeah.
That's so awesome.
I think I think these future-facing libraries are incredibly important for PHP. Like we already know from the whole MySQL, MySQLi, PDO kind of nonsense that people just don't update their code. They just don't. In PHP, you can just knock out a bunch of crap code and leave it on your $5 GoDaddy host for 10 years and expect it to still run. And over to something else, then it damn well has to be a generic API that can handle whatever comes in the future reasonably well with minimal change. And if we're getting people to change from one thing to another, then make sure they don't have to change again in 2 years' time, because they just won't bother, and they'll keep their same crap insecure code even if the hosts are updating PHP version. They're still going to be using this crap library unless it just does it in the background for them.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes the password hashing API beautiful. If we get to 7.3 and they switch to Argon 2, some variant of Argon 2, or YesScript, then transparently all new hashes generated will be using the new algorithm. So if bcrypt dies in like 2020, it won't be a big deal because everybody will have silently been upgrading their password hashes the entire time.
Well,
assuming they use password
default anyway, yeah. It's like some people will put password decrypt. And to be honest, like this whole silent upgrade thing is really nice, but I bet you that someone out there has made a MySQL table where there's a fixed length column that is only as long as the hash bcrypt produces.
I was just about to say that.
What's going to happen is we're going to introduce some new algorithm. Maybe it'll be Argon 2, maybe it'll be something new, and then we'll discover that, oh no, we've just completely corrupted a lot of people's password hashes. But we'll see. We'll see how things turn out.
That's definitely going to happen, and it's going to be.
People just don't read the manual.
On PHP 7.3, why can't I log into my account anymore? Be like, yeah, you set a field limit on your MySQL table.
It's incredible. Like, people do not read the manual. Like, the manual is. The PHP manual says all sorts of silly things, but like it's at least official and sort of updated and maintained. Other sources aren't. Like, there are a lot of sites out there that tell you to use password hash with a constant that isn't even designed for password hashing. It's designed for the crypt function. And it is only by sheer coincidence that both of those constants have the same value in the PHP implementation, and it just happens to work. But like, I'm terrified. Somewhere out there, lots of people out there will be doing the wrong thing, and it'll just go all wrong.
I invite you all to add stuff to PHP the right way, because that's usually where people get sent when there's bad information in other locations.
It's one of those you can lead a horse to water. I mean, we can only do so much, and I think we're headed in the right direction. So, yeah.
Yeah, I get really excited every time there's a new security feature that is being proposed to PHP and making it security easy, because the longer I am as a web developer going along this journey, it makes security becomes more and more important every time. Like, I used to be kind of like this afterthought, but now it's like it's really at the forefront every time I do something now. It's insane. People's identities constantly getting stolen, mainly because of insecure web things, and it's just so paramount and important. So yes, my hat is off to you, Scott, for your endeavors on making PHP more secure. And we're kind of getting close to needing to wrap it up here. I did want to at least mention one RFC that is just absolutely fresh off of the printing press here. It's like literally 4 hours ago, Nikita posted it to the internals thread, and it's PHP 7.1 deprecations. And I just want to quickly kind of go through a couple of these things, because the underscore.
I need to read this now.
What's that? You haven't read it yet? It's super fresh. So it's the underscore autoload magic function. He's saying that it has. I'm just kind of reading this off the RFC. This function has been suppressed by the SPL autoload register function in PHP 5.1 and is used and its use is discouraged in the documentation. And so they're wanting to remove that or deprecate that in 7.1. Also, the PHP underscore error MSG variable, which is created in the local scope whenever a non-fatal error is thrown. If the track underscore errors INI setting is enabled, which is disabled by default, and the error is not being consumed by an error handler. So kind of removing global scoped variables. That's always nice. And there's two more here. There's the create underscore function to deprecate that, which is a thin wrapper around the eval language construct, allowing the creation of a function with a generated function name and the argument list and body code provided as string arguments. I'm kind of like not quite understanding what this is all about, but basically deprecating that function. And then lastly, deprecating rand and srand, and kind of showing that, or offering alternatives, mtrand and mtsrand, or maybe even random_int, I think would probably be good ones, especially for cryptographic contexts. But to deprecate rand and srand, I'm all for that.
So I actually have a project on GitHub that's along the same lines. The use case of srand and rand is if you want to have a pre-shared seed for a random number generator, so that way two machines are generating the same data for some reason, like a Monte Carlo simulation. And I called it seed spring because I love really bad puns. So it's actually based off the AES cipher in counter mode. And what it does is you send your seed, you set your position within this key stream, and it'll just generate random bytes by encrypting like a null stream and just giving you the key stream that you would normally XOR with your plain text. So I definitely think getting rid of getting rid of srand and rand is a good idea. Yeah, we don't have a comparable one for random int, but that's a good thing because that's meant to be secure.
All of the things listed in that RFC should be set on fire.
I could comment on some of these, like empty rand, empty srand, rand and srand. Like there was a post on Reddit's PHP subreddit, like literally today or yesterday, last 24 hours, which was a problem which we think was caused by someone using rand on Windows, because they're wondering why they kept getting the same sequence of numbers. And the reason is because the Windows random number generator was written ages ago and they can't change it, and it's terrible. So it doesn't take very long before you start getting the same results again.
It's actually one of the things... Sorry, carry on.
So yeah, what were you going to say?
I was going to say it's one of the things listed on PHP Sadness, which I'd like to see gone as well. I've been talking to the guy that runs PHP Sadness, and I let him know when things are knocked off, and he's really happy to see that his complaints are being removed one at a time. Like half of them are gone, but rand is still on there, and they kind of make fun of PHP a little bit because rand was discovered to not actually be random, so they just added a new one called MT, which is like better rand. Instead of implementing over the top of rand and making it better, they're just like, oh, here's this other function that you should try and remember to use, right? So yeah, getting rid of rand and just kind of pointing people towards MT rand and other better improvements would be really helpful.
Could we not just alias rand to MT rand? And srand to MT srand?
There's an argument against it, and I can't remember what.
Why
there is
not?
a problem there. Like
people don't, they want rand, but not that much randomness.
The problem is srand. Like some people, inevitably, someone out there relies on srand if you give it some number, always producing the same sequence of numbers. And actually, that is why we still have rand and srand. Why we didn't replace them with empty rand and empty srand originally. So if we just replace them, then basically someone, it's rather unlikely, but someone out there's app might break. So ideally we should deprecate it and get them to move off it somehow. It's rather unlikely, but there is a small chance it will cause problems for someone, which is why we shouldn't just alias them, at least not in 7.2 or something. We should maybe in 8.
I can guarantee that anybody who's using those functions is doing something very bad, like turning rand and srand into a stream cipher. I think Cake PHP 2 did that.
It's useful for simulations and video games, but not many people write those in PHP, although I do know there is a clone of Advance Wars that's written in PHP that's pretty good.
Well, we're really kind of over time here, so we got to start wrapping it up. And first of all, I want to actually at least mention probably the most controversial RFC that's been proposed recently, and that is the Code of Conduct RFC, which originally was proposed by Anthony Ferrara. No groaning. We're not going there. Don't worry. We're not going there.
Didn't Town Hall just have an episode on the
Yeah,
Code of
cross
I
Conduct?
haven't seen that one yet, but I'm ready to. I'm sure it got really ranty on the side of Phil. Maybe I don't know.
No,
I'm just
there's
guessing.
actually a PHP Town Hall episode, the one that's the video's up online, but the audio isn't yet, and it's actually a very sober, responsible, interesting conversation. And Jenny Wong joins us, and she calls me wrong a bunch of times, and it's a really good conversation. It's one of my favorite episodes yet, so go check that out. If you're
Awesome.
interested in the
Yeah,
code.
I'm definitely wanting to check that one out. I saw it was up a little while ago, but I haven't checked it out yet. But Derek Rethens has taken it over, and I've kind of chatted with him, and I think we might actually do an episode dedicated to the Code of Conduct. And I've been trying to follow it along a little bit and contribute back to it as much as I can. And so we'll revisit that topic, and when it becomes a little bit more solid and worked out a little bit. Also, I want to mention Andrew Huggins. I did this in the last episode too, but he created a repo for the show notes because I'm not good at actually writing these show notes. So he actually wrote some show notes for a couple of the episodes and put it in a repo, and we've actually put it on GitHub under the PHP Roundtable namespace. So if you go to github.com/PHP Roundtable, you'll see a little repo in there, show notes, and if you're listening to these things and you're taking notes along the way, just take notes and put them in Markdown and send a PR to the repo, and you're not only contributing to an open source project, but everybody's benefiting. And I'm going to give you a personal shout out and say thank you so and so for writing the show notes for episode such and such. So yes, if you're interested in doing that, definitely check it out on github.com/PHP Roundtable. And finally, we got to wrap this thing up with the developer shout out, which is my favorite segment because we get to recognize somebody really awesome in the community for doing their awesome things. And what we're doing is providing them a $50 Amazon gift card from Laracasts.com. So Jeffrey Way, this guy has all these screencasts on this website, Laracasts.com. And you can learn all kinds of things about not only Laravel. There's a lot of stuff on Laravel, but there's all kinds of things on testing, setting up IDEs. There's stuff on setting up PHP Storm. I'm actually going through right now the one on how to use Vim properly and really getting it set up to where you're a Vim master. So I've been forcing myself to actually use Vim in certain situations to where I can really up my Vim skills, which right now are extremely basic. I've got Vim key bindings on for PHP Storm, and that's as Vimy as I get. So his tutorials and screencasts are just absolutely phenomenal. You'll learn tons. I highly recommend it. So thank you, Laracast, for sponsoring the developer shout-out, as always. And our panel nominated this official person for the developer shout-out in this episode, and is Paul Dragunis. And Paul's been on this show before. I think, Phil, were you the one who originally mentioned that, or Davey? I can't remember who.
Davey.
Why do we nominate Paul for this one?
He's been working his ass off on the PHP.net website. He does a lot of work on it. He's helped with a few other people. Davey, do you know who else does the website?
I don't know his name, but BWOEIBI, Bobby. I don't know how you say his name.
Bob Vinand.
Yeah, so I know there's a couple other people working on it, but he was the one who really kind of pushed and got the new version out, and did all that thankless work.
Levi do it as well. I can't remember.
Yeah, I know there's, like I said, I know there's a couple people, but he definitely took the lead and was like, you know what, this has been in development for a while. Let's just get it out there and actually move forward. So
yeah, I saw Paul sifting through the garbage fire that is RPHP, trying to find valid feedback and then implementing those changes. So he managed to wade through that festering pile of nonsense to get good feedback.
True that. Well, Paul, I will be sending you a message to try to figure out your snail mail address and get you a thank you card to get in the mail. And yeah, thank you so much for being involved in the PHP.net project and everything else you do, because I know you do a bunch of other things. And thanks again, Laracast, for sponsoring the developer shoutout. And real quick, let's take a moment to do some shameless plugs. Andrea, do you have anything that you want to promote?
Shameless. Oh wait, isn't shameless plugs where you promote your own things?
Indeed.
I have several really terrible packages on Packagist. You should use one of them. They're really terrible. Actually, one of them is decent, which is a simple package called NewType, which lets you wrap. Say you have an integer, it makes a class for you that wraps an integer. That's all it does. It's a single function. If you're really lazy and want to make your if you want cleaner type hints. So that's my shameless plug. Don't use any of my other packages. They're terrible. Really don't. This isn't reverse psychology, although it might be interesting if it is.
I kind of want to use them now.
Nice. What about you, Davey? You got anything you want to promote?
I guess not promote, maybe ask for help. Talking about RFCs, I am working on an RFC to add HTTP2 to the CLI server. As I mentioned, I'm not a C developer, so this is way beyond my capabilities. So if anybody has C knowledge and would like to work on that, maybe mentor some, whatever, that would be awesome. But I'm hoping to also get Streams Layer, HTTP2 support, and an NG HTTP2 client as well as a companion to curl. So yeah, it'd be really awesome.
Cool. What about you, François? Oh, you're muted. You gotta unmute yourself real quick. There you go.
You hear me? Yeah. I just wanted people to vote on an RFC. I open vote today about negative string support for negative string offsets in many built-in functions and in PHP. So people with a right to vote on RFCs are welcome to vote on these.
Yeah, I'm surprised we didn't actually talk about that one very much, but you did. The negative string RFC that you've got in the mix right now. It's to make a consistent API with what is it, string position,
yes,
or substring, I think.
As Andrea told about consistencies, that's all about consistency in 7.1.
Nice.
Yeah, because we accept negative offsets in some functions and not on others. We don't accept in the language when taking bytes from a string, and that's inconsistent. So it's a small step towards better consistency. Yeah. So
nice.
vote for it.
Very cool. Awesome. What about you, Phil? You got anything you want to promote? I know you've got stuff to promote.
Yeah, I've always got something to promote. Madeinproduction.com. It's a website where me and Zach Kitzmiller sell silly T-shirts about programming. We used to have the double claw, which you might have seen, but we got 2 new T-shirts. Too busy to write unit tests and too lazy to write unit tests. One's got like a video game pad, and the other one's got an armchair. Those are two. The too lazy to write tests is pretty much the only excuse, and too busy is just a bit of a joke about, like, you're never too busy, just bloody well do it, write some tests.
Am I allowed to buy a PHP League t-shirt without being a League member?
Yes, they're available on madeinproduction.com as well.
Will people think I'm being really arrogant if I wear that t-shirt?
Yes, you are trying to steal everybody's code and trying to take over the PHP community just to suit my ego. That's what happens if you wear the PHP League t-shirt, but you're allowed to wear one if you want.
And I actually want to plug you again for your. I know you've had this one out for a while. The APIs you won't hate book, build APIs that you won't hate book. Because I did actually read that for not so long ago, and I tell you, the biggest thing I got out of that book was Postman. Holy crap! That extension, that Chrome extension, Postman. I thought I was doing it great with this little this Mac app called HTTP Client, and I was hitting all my endpoints like that. And it was just a pain in the butt. But Postman, holy crap, it's so powerful. I can't imagine designing an API without Postman now.
Strangely enough, this might be a talk for another time, but I've moved away from using Postman now.
No way!
It was really useful for a while, but now I just TDD the crap out of it. I just really cover my all of my endpoints. I do a lot of unit testing. We do a lot of unit testing at my company, and we also do integration testing, which sets up all of the endpoints with all the different contexts and the different tokens, and we just do it through TDD with using RSpec. I'm going to write an article about that soon, but Postman is really good as well. It's just not quite as good as it could be.
You're already on the next thing. All right, cool. That's awesome. I'd love to hear about that. So, what about you, Scott? You got anything you want to promote?
Well, there's my company, Paragon Initiative Enterprises. We do code review. We do software development. If you're just starting out, security might not be a big concern, but 6 months down the line, when you have data protect, you might want to start thinking about application security. It's a lot cheaper to hire a security consultant than it is to get breached. So definitely consider that.
Absolutely. It's paramount. Sweet. Well, if you guys Let me see where I've got coming up next. Oh, yes. So their next episode will be from Idea to Production Part 2, taking the dancer deck idea that we discussed a couple months ago and talking about what the next steps are to actually make this idea turn into an actual production app. And finally, we'll be talking about graph databases in this month. So we got 2 more episodes this month, trying to catch up to where I had a little bit of a lapse in schedule for December and January, so trying to play some catch up here. If you have an idea that you'd like to share on the roundtable, or you have an idea that you want people to talk about, hit me up on Twitter. I'm Sammy K, or hit up PHP Roundtable, or just go to phproundtable.com. There's a form you can fill out to say, hey, I got this idea. I'd like to thank Andrea, Davey, François, Phil, and Scott for joining us in this episode, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Loving the wink, Sammy. Loving the wink. Well done. Well moderated.